Hi, in this video, we're going to be highlighting some of the content regarding sexualities that is specifically built within stratification and inequality. So for this portion of the content for the sexualities chapter, um, I'm going to be reviewing issues related to the segments of the chapter on divided desire, eroticized inequality, sexual racism, and gendered scripts. And then you'll notice that there will be a couple of pages also that are dedicated to sexual violence and to hookup culture as well. So these things aren't being ignored. They just won't be in this video. So one of the things that we talked about previously was the division and who is viewed as sexy and who is viewed as sexual. And we noticed that a lot of this division is based on the gender binary and expectations regarding sex roles, as well as expectations regarding, like, more specifically, who's going to be pursued and who's going to be in pursuit. So when we combine this with the prevalence of the heterosexual male gaze, we can kind of get some ideas about how men and women are impacted by these expectations and the double standards built into those expectations. So if you're unfamiliar with the male gaze, it's actually a concept that comes from communications and films studies, where you're looking at how primarily like male directors and producers and so on um, create content, especially from a heteronormative stance, that is from the position of a man and like what he would see and how he would see it, or how he would prefer to see it. So in this dynamic, one of the things that happens here is that on the more feminine side, there's an experience of sexual objectification. And this is where women and others experience the reduction of their personhood just to whatever value they have via sex. And often that means that they become less humanized and are viewed as objects. And you probably don't need a whole lot of explanation about why that's not desirable. Why people shouldn't be viewed as objects. You don't treat objects with the same amounts of respect and value, I hope, as you necessarily would treat one another. On the more masculine side, often the experience is sexual subjectification. And this isn't only for men, but men and others are told what they should be looking at and be focusing on and how they should feel. And so, of course, there's going to be some element of socialization that's occurring here. And objectification in particular, going back to that one, can occur via self-objectification as well. And that's where the sexual objectification is internalized. And so that means that the expectations are not only being exerted on a person from the outside, but they are also internalized expectations as well. Which can be really hard when you're trying to live up to a standard that is unrealistic, which is usually the typical standard for many women, especially in the United States, in our nation, that's very diverse, but has less diverse views of beauty. Another concept that's brought up in this chapter, called spectating, can also support self-objectification as well, and of course can be influenced by objectification altogether. So with spectating, typically women and non-heterosexual men are going to be the most prone to spectating behaviors. Similarly to objectification and sexual objectification, self-objectification, sorry. They might focus on how they look or appear when it comes to actual sexual behavior and activity, and focus on that, or have anxiety or concern about that, to the extent where they end up depriving themselves of sexual pleasure. And so it's a lose-lose situation because I think that any self-reflection on how one is um, being spectated during a sexual act is probably going to be inaccurate. And also because then what was the point, for that partner who is involved in the spectating, um, and that self objectification? What are they getting out of it? Are they winning in any way, shape, or form? So, something to think about there. So, with the erotic marketplace, we start to look at some of the eroticized inequality that's involved in sexualities. And so, we often see that heteronormativity impacts who we view as being sexually desirable along the lines of gender performance. And so, typically, regardless of whether this is heteronormative based views of sexual desirability or non heteronormative based views of sexual desirability, either way, most often we'll find that people prefer to have those roles existing in that behavior, activity, interaction. And so when it comes to um, heteronormative interactions, um, among men, there's most likely going to be a preference to interact with women who are really like nailing that feminine role. And for women, it's going to be, the exact same thing, where they're going to be more preferable of men who are focused on being masculine, right? Or who are performing masculinity. I think it's super interesting that the same is true as well, for same gender relationships. Um, and it's such an interesting dynamic to see that socialization still occurs um, in these situations where we know that gender is inextricable from um, sexual orientation, even, although it shouldn't have anything to do with one another, and they should be fully unrelated. They are, right? Gender identities, gender roles still influence, or they still have some interaction, at least in patterns, when it comes to sexual interaction. So yeah, it's interesting, right, to see that even among non-heteronormative men, that in same gender relationships, the majority of men prefer men who are more masculine. And then we get the term masking, which is not necessarily a new term, but which is a term that I hadn't connected to this sociological theoretical perspective in the past. And that's where the masking with a K usually is actually transformed to masking like masculine with a C. And here the mask is the mask of masculinity. So this is a really interesting concept of, emphasizing masculinity, knowing that is something that is desired, even in a same gender sexual interaction, or is more likely to be desired. And one of the problems with this, obviously, is that it's inherently rooted in stratification and in inequality, like people being perceived, as desirable or not, is based on a ranking, right? And so you can see some examples in your text of how this eroticized inequality is not just about gender, but obviously also about race. And that's where we start getting into things like fetishisms, and we start getting into ideas about like who is attractive, who is desirable. You get into the stereotypes of the asexual Asian male, for example. I'm going to give you all a link to a really interesting video that introduces that concept, or the lotus blossom, as you can see in this image that's on this slide. This is a film called Sayonara, and it's very old, obviously. But I just was cracking up at the description where it says, "This is Marlon Brando and an exquisite new Japanese star." Period. Right? Um, this actress who makes the front cover, right, and who is a leading actress in the film, her name isn't even listed. Not maybe at the bottom, and I haven't looked to see who's down there and what their names are, so I don't even know. But her name isn't listed. Marlon Brando's name is at the top, and it's in big, huge red caps. And she can't even get her name in the black and white, right? And so she's literally being treated as an object here, just like as a Japanese doll or a geisha or something like that. She's being objectified in this image, even in the pose and how he's holding her and everything. Um, Definitely the assertiveness on his part, and this expectation that she's going to be like, uh, adaptable, right, and that she could be molded, or that she will be subservient in some way. It's really dangerous because beyond being racist, it can actually basically eroticize someone because of their race, so that they receive attention that is directed specifically towards them only because of their race. And so it can be really dangerous. It can add to and complicate or enhance instances of sexual assault or rape that are based on, this racialized rape culture, which we'll talk about rape culture a bit more in a moment. So yeah, it's super problematic. It's been a problem for Asian men and Asian women in particular for a very long time, and it's not new. I think the fact that we're talking about it is new. And I think that the fact that people are starting to somehow like wake up and find like Asian actors attractive and things like that is really interesting, especially male actors specifically, because they're not even coming to terms with the fact that often people had to be told that it's okay, right, to find these men attractive. And so, yeah, it's super interesting. It can lead to a lot of issues and problems in our intergroup relations. So a lot of racist gender ideas actually play out in sexual stereotypes. So Black men and Latinx men are stereotyped as being hyper masculine and hypersexual, right? Which often means that they're viewed as being aggressive, assertive, as being dangerous. And Asian men, of course, are, as I talked about in the previous slide, are stereotyped as hyperfeminine and sexually deficient. Asian women, on the flip side, are usually stereotyped as being hyperfeminine as well and sexually malleable, while Black women are stereotyped as being masculine and sexually undesirable. Um, so one of the things that I like to point out at this point is that sometimes people believe that they are riding a line between being between having a preference and fetishizing someone. But I think that a lot of times that line, everyone's on the same side, because in and of itself, desiring partners because of their race is a type of sexual objectification. It just is. It is what it is. Thinking that someone is desirable specifically because of their race, right? That is the first thing that draws someone to another person, right? It's a type of sexual objectification. and especially from the side of whiteness, right? Where there is a significant advantage in the erotic marketplace as well, right? Um, and so this is really complex because it's not just coming from the aspect of a white person who is fetishizing non-white people, but it could also be looked at from BIPOC or non-white people who might fetishize white people as well because of that advantage, because they're at the top of the erotic marketplace totem pole, perhaps. And this is really very much goes along a color spectrum altogether. That's where colorism comes back in, where you have lighter skinned people of color, being closer to uh, that white end of the spectrum, and more likely to marry white people also than dark skinned people of color. You'll notice that, um, however, there has been a big jump in um, changes when it comes to partnering since the pandemic, and more specifically since the Black Lives Matter protests back in the summer of 2020. And so a lot of this is very political, and shaped by the political identities that people want to reflect. And it's really interesting to see how much of a change, if you look in your text, it actually has some data in there that shows how much there's been a jump in just like 3 or 4 years, and the number of people who report being um, willing to be in an interracial relationship, or who report actually being in an interracial relationship, and that it's just increased. And so it's interesting, like, to also think about like how will these trends hold, and what does the future look like when it comes to this, and what does it mean? So sexual scripts are a way of describing the figurative existence of a dramatic interaction in our social interactions, that we are on a stage and we're playing out these roles, right, gender roles, using a script, right? Using a guideline, something that tells us what's supposed to happen when, who's supposed to do what, when. And so in the US, our sexual scripts are, I laughed as I was going through the content in the text. And I laughed again as I was like writing notes for this video, that, it starts with people kissing, and that kissing first starts with closed mouth kissing, and then it starts to increase to becoming open mouth kissing. And then it goes on to being other things. And then, like, it even goes into describing how clothing is removed and who does what, when, where, how, and what order. And I'm like, oh, I can't think of many examples in the media, on TV shows and films, whatever, that don't follow that script. And I can't think of examples, um, even when we're looking at like same gender sexual interaction, it usually follows that same kind of sexual script. Um, I think the difference, there's like a toss up, it says in your text, and I would expect that the difference would be that the likelihood of a person who is more masculine or who is more feminine in an interaction, taking the lead on who does what, might be different, but I don't know. That's just an inference. Um, so it's interesting, I think, and part of the reason why I even make that inference, take a little liberty to make that inference, is because usually sexual scripts are super rigid, and so to even in a same gender sexual interaction, to see that there might even be a slight difference. In the order of how things occur and who does what, um, it's definitely, like, whoa, like, we can buck gender roles even, in a same gender interaction. Um, Another thing that comes up with a gendered script is, I mean, we've kind of talked about this already, with those divided desires or whatever, is that there's a push and resist dynamic. And this is where there's a situation, um, where we expect that masculine people or people performing masculinity um, are going to be the ones who are going to push for sexual activity, right? Or push for increased intimacy and sexual activity. And that it would be the person who is performing femininity who's going to want to stop or slow down intimacy, who's going to be the one who's saying, okay, that's too far, and take a step back. And the interesting thing about this dynamic is, again, it's based on these roles and expectations, and it has nothing to do with what the individual actually wants, oftentimes. Sometimes they'll engage in, that dynamic because it is the expectation, and for that reason alone, because they don't want to buck the expectation, right? They don't want to seem like someone who doesn't follow that dynamic for whatever reason. And what do you think those reasons are? What's the fear there? What would be the consequence for a man or person performing masculinity who decided that he wanted to stop or slow down when it came to moving a sexually intimate moment forward, right? Or what would be the consequence in reality, not what you see on TV, not what you see in films, but the consequence in reality for a woman who wants to push sexually towards more increased intimacy and activity. What happens, right? What do people say? How do they describe these interactions? And how does that description vary by their gender, right? So yeah, this stuff is so complicated, but super interesting. So when it comes to same gender sexual scripts, these are not all that different from heteronormative sexual scripts, um, because typically there's still that dichotomy of having somebody who's expected to be passive and receptive, um, or somebody who's expected to be maybe active, or, as your text points out, penetrative. Um, and that this often falls along the same lines as those roles being, directed into the binary of being feminine and masculine. And this is also racialized to further complicate things. For example, Asian men apparently are stereotyped as being feminine, and therefore they are rightful bottoms and subordinated. Whereas when it comes to Black men, um, remember we said that they were more likely to be fetishized as hyper masculine and then thought of as being rightful tops or being dominant. But then that race can actually get in there and be really messy with twisting the dynamics of topping and bottoming, which is just highly problematic when it comes to seeing this reflection in reproduction and racial hierarchies. And again, it's not just for same gender sexual scripts. This is also true in heteronormative sexual scripts as well. One example that's given in the text is that Black men who have sex with white men report being expected to be on top, on the assumption that they're going to be aggressive, right? So there's this expectation. And then I would assume when they don't fit into that expectation, it's going to be followed by disappointment. And that when having sex with Black men, white men sometimes recast themselves, right? And bottoming as being like served, right? And so they are more likely to racialize their experience, even to the extent where one of the participants, I think they were interviewed in the text, said he refused to bottom for white men because on more than one occasion he'd been referred to as the N-word. So, or during that interaction. So yeah, it's problematic. But again, it's not limited to same gender sexual scripts for sure.